Welcome to the Cross Border Interview Podcast, a podcast about getting out from behind the keyboard and just talking. Each week, we invite a guest or two to sit down and talk about their life and their work. I'm Christopher Brown, your host, and this is the Cross Border Interview Podcast featuring
Councillor Keating.
Councillor Keating, I want to thank you so much for doing this. Greatly appreciate it. Earlier this year, earlier in 2020, you announced, because this will be airing in 2021, you announced that you will be stepping down from public office at the end of this current term. We want to talk about, we had a week-long series last season of municipal councillors and elected leaders, and we thought we would expand it this year to do a month-long. So I'm glad that you're willing to sit down and chat about your time in office. My first question usually to all elected leaders is this: where did your sense of duty come from?
My previous career, of course, I was 31 years in education. And I mean, that in itself leads you to understand an awful lot of what goes on in the community, in people's lives, because, literally tens of thousands of students have crossed my path over that time. Being involved in many people said, boy, it must be much different being an elected official than being a school principal or, an educator or a teacher or an assistant principal. All these. I said, no, it's exactly the same. When I was a principal, I was dealing with, with parents, with students, with administration, with the community. I was in meetings, involved in projects. You're dealing with the community around the school. You're talking with public funds. So really, the skills and attributes that I gained there, all they did was transfer. A totally different mindset, of course, and a different level. You're talking about budgets in the billions rather than in the hundreds of thousands to some degree. But it's always been there, and of course, my personal interest in public issues or current affairs and all of these, that stems from me, but also being in that position as well. You get an awfully good sense, when I say seeing tens of thousands of students in that long, of the differences in society. You come out and everyone thinks they know, but really they don't. And having a willingness and an openness to look at the other side is crucial in any position that I would consider as an elected official. And along that lines, I'll give you one of my sayings off the top is there's a fine line between a politician and an elected official, but there's a massive difference. And if you can follow that, you can kind of see where I've come from. But my initial jump into politics in this case was I was the chair of a community association that used to be in the municipality of Rocky View, and then it was annexed by the city of Calgary. And the differences and the difficulty that we had with that annexation of being absorbed into the city led me to say, maybe I can do something that's, a little different. It didn't sit right with me on how things had to be according to the city rather than how we were originally. And the history of this community association goes back to the 1930s. There was a lot of history there and a plan. And the city said, well, you must be like everyone else in the city, not the way you are. And that didn't sit right with me. So I threw my name in, and the sitting alderman at that time was leaving and running for mayor. So I said, well, I'll see what I can do.
Before your actual entrance into elected politics, had you had a political interest beforehand? Had it been something on your mind, or was it something that came out of that, like you said, that conversation of the city of Calgary telling your community what you are expected to be like, and not the vice versa?
Yeah, well, I have to say there was always an interest, no action to ever taken. It wasn't something that I pursued, but the interest was always there and seeing what was going on. And that comes back to, whether you're interested in helping the community, because as a community association president, as a school principal, as a member who in many, many different communities have coached, minor sports and worked on different clubs, Kinsman, a number of these sorts of things. So there was always that willingness to go outside and to do something, to actually go forward and say, I want to run in any aspect. That didn't come until the opportunity was there. And in this case, it seemed to fit. So there was an interest, but no action ever taken. I never sat on any political boards, for elected officials, any constituency boards, any of these. And in fact, I was never involved in any campaigns per se. There was one just before this where a friend wanted to get the nomination for a political party. So I bought a membership and I talked to a few people and said, you should vote for him. He's helped us out at our community association. And that's been the extent. So until this came along, and I think more or less just watching the news and keeping up on political aspects was my participation at that point.
So I want to digest into your comment about being an elected official and a politician. Sometimes people get into politics for a certain reason, and they want to champion a issue or another issue. And then once they're in, they get complacent sometimes, and they become that politician of, I'll go knock on doors during the campaign, but during the time in office, I'll stay in sort of the hub of the governance of that time or that location. What would you classify yourself as? Do you still classify yourself as an elected official, or do you classify yourself as a politician now?
Absolutely not. I mean, I have stated in council, I said, I'm an elected official, not a politician. And an elected official, and here's one of my other sayings so when I decided to run, I mean, I had no experience. Yeah. I went out and bought a couple books on how to run a campaign. And so I read and did a little research before I jumped into it. And I pulled out a few things from there, which have stuck with me for the last 10 years. And so the second saying I have is being an elected official should never be the best job you ever had, because then the job becomes more important than the job you are elected to do. Okay. And that's my difference between an elected official and a politician is an elected official always looks at the basis of why they got in, what they're there for, what's the purpose of their job is to look after the residents in their area. In our case, it's wards. They're there for the betterment of the community. They're all of those things. A politician is out there to advance themselves in whatever aspects. And I've often said there's three kinds of politicians or elected officials. There's those who are there for the job, meaning that they're there for the betterment. There are those who are there for, I guess, the status to some degree. You do, and there's no sense denying that. You get invited and you get a few more privileges than other positions there. And then there are those who are there for themselves. And those who are there, and again, you always cross those paths a little bit, to some degree, because they come together, but it's the main purpose of why you're involved. You get invited to a number of things that you would never get invited to, and so that's that ability to get a few extra privileges, if you want to call it that, like to major balls or to banquets or to events and things like that come, they're little perks that come with the job. But they're also the job because you're there to represent and make sure that you're promoting your ward or your area, and you can't do it if you're isolating yourself. But it comes back to one of those three things of what's your main purpose. And if you're only there for yourself, then obviously, and we've seen it here, and it's the style of politics to some degree that has come forward, is I'm going to spread not outright untruths, but so close to being untrue that it promotes you, and people get into that key of weaponized misinformation. It's sad when you get into that politician style of mentality and behavior. If you can stay into that elected official style of behavior and mentality, I think you're a far better individual and a far better elected person.
Let's talk about that first campaign in 2010. You said you hadn't run a campaign, you were reading books. What was the first step for you? Was it hard to actually get off the ground? Because in larger municipalities, like larger cities like the city of Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto, you have to have a well-organized machine to win even local municipality, even wards. How did you get it up so quickly? Because it was a vacant seat, so there was a few people running against you. How did you get a team around you so quickly that you were able to be successful? Or was there hiccups along the way?
Oh, there's always hiccups for sure, and you have to adjust those and move forward in many different manners. But I wouldn't even say it was that quickly. It was stirring in my mind probably a little over a year before the election, because we all knew that this individual was going to leave and run for mayor. But he hadn't come out and announced it and then moved forward from there in that aspect. So it was an inkling there as should I or should I not? And I was getting to the end of my education career. I mean, I wasn't quite there, and I left about 3 years too early to really finish off my retirement packages, if you want to say it, and things like that. But it worked out. So I mean, so I started, thinking about where I'm going and what I'm doing, and I would say well over a year before, because I remember in the summer before talking to the sitting alderman, and I said, well, why don't you run for mayor and I'll run in your place and we can really work on this community association. And this was actually sitting out our community hall at the time where we were trying to get some things done. And of course, his response was, who knows, type of thing. But since then, I bought the books, and I would say I bought the books before January of the election year, and the election's always in October. Yeah. And then I, was sitting on a number of committees in the area as well. We had one called Seekers, which was the Southeast Recreational Society. That was looking at building new rec centers, and you meet people along the way. And so I happened to, talk to one individual and just say, hey, I'm thinking of this. Are you interested? Because they were communications and things like this and stuff. So you just talk to a few over the time. So if you wake up in the morning and say, hey, I'm going to run, you really haven't put much thought into it. If you have a process and you mull things over for an extended period of time, and you formulate your style and who you are and what you want to do, and then you start looking for people, you're going to find the right people. Because again, if you wake up one morning and say, I'm going to phone this one and this one and that one, you don't know if they're the right people that will emulate your style or your personality, or are they just going to get you elected? And that's not what I wanted to do. So along the way, and I'll tell you a little story, I went to the individual who, the previous alderman who's going to run for mayor, and to a huge fundraiser or an event that they had, and you had to pay $100 and some to get into it. So I had my little business cards, that I was going to run for alderman, but I hadn't said anything yet. And so he announced that he was running for mayor. And so then I took my business cards and I started walking around to people, and I gave him a business card and I said, is he cold yet? So, like this, so that's who I am, from that, and my business card had a very important message on it. It says, I'm aspiring to be your alderman. And that aspiring comes back, and a lot of people picked up on that word. That comes back to the point of who you are, what you want to do, the elected official aspect. You're not there. You're not trying to convince them that you're the best. You're trying to convince you that you're the best for them. So that aspiring aspect. And it's a simple word, but it makes a lot of difference when you look at it. And so from that, actually, I had a couple people call me from that evening and say, hey, we live in the ward. We're interested. Can we have, meet for a cup of coffee or tea? And from that meeting, I gained 3 individuals who were absolutely the best match I could find, who had political experience. And they knew many things. I never was on Twitter or any of the social media, and they were experts in that area. So, that's, I think, where you begin to lay out the strategy and the plan. And it isn't so much that you lay out a plan, you develop a plan as you go. Some
people might say that municipal politics can be an election of favorites. It's not the best idea that potentially always wins. It might be the person who is most well known, the person who is the most prominent person on the ballot. After your election in 2010, did you reach out to your fellow competitors and say, hey, just because I won or just because I'm the successful alderman here doesn't mean that we can't still work together moving forward?
I can't say I said that. I did reach out and say, thanks for the participation and that sort of thing. I have to sadly say I ran against four individuals. There were five on the ballot. And my first time running, and I'm not blowing my own horn, but I'm quite happy, with the way it was. I got 43% of the vote. And, when you divide it up that way, and there were really three of us that had the potential, were in the running. The other two, they were there, but again, they didn't have, whether it was funds or just determination or whatever, but they weren't really players. But there were three of us were there, and when you reach out, and unfortunately I didn't hear back from those individuals, because usually you reach out and say congratulations or, thanks for the participation, but where you go from. And I mean, coming back to your point, I think municipal politics is slightly different than federal or provincial. No, it's not slightly, it's vastly different. And people don't understand that. I mean, we have a present councillor who stands up often, and I think he's stopped it now because I told him to quit. He would say when someone disagrees, well, the member opposite. Well, we don't have member opposites in municipal politics, and we never should. If we ever get into parties like many cities do, it's absolutely terrible. But you look at it in there, and one of the individuals that I ran against in 10 had a quote from an MP, and a very popular MP, on his brochure. And he came in second, and I wouldn't say a distant second, but certainly second by a fair bit. Yeah. So it is in many cases a name. And I think the sad part is municipal politics is the level that affects you the most, and it's the least participated or the least researched. And the difficulty of the other ones is if you win the nomination for a party, that determines whether you win or lose. Yeah. It's not who you are. And that's the sad part about the whole party politics and the other ones. In municipal politics, if you aren't the candidate, especially in a case like that where the incumbent is leaving, if you don't go out and convince enough people that you are the candidate, then it's on you. It's not on anyone else. And if you don't do well, it's on you. It's not on anyone else. And that's the way it should be. But you have to continue to go out and make sure that your personality, your individual style, and your willingness continues to go forward.
In 2010, like we've talked about so far, you were the successful candidate in Ward 10. Talk to me about that, stepping into the council chambers for the first time, being sworn in. After being sworn in, what type of weight was put on your shoulders in that moment? Because you have now gone from someone who has been a political observer for almost a year to now someone who's making decisions that could affect day-to-day lives. Like you said, municipal politics is one of the most influential day-to-day politics of every person's life. Now you are in the heart of Calgary's political atmosphere, universe. How much weight was put on your shoulders at that moment?
Well, if you take it to heart, an awful lot. And again, that comes back to my three styles of elected officials. If you're that one that you're there to do the best you can for the community, that's a huge weight. And I have to tell you, honestly, I was never more nervous in my life than the swearing in ceremony. And I've spoken to at many different things before this, and to a few thousand people in a couple of cases. But here, whether it was just the whole impact and my stepson-in-law said at one time, he says, you're preparing yourself to lose, but are you preparing yourself to win? And that's a big thing. I mean, it's easy in many cases if you have that mentality to say, yeah, darn it, I came in second and I really had a good time and all of these sorts of things. But darn it, I won. And what the heck do I do? And you have to get that mentality around it. And that comes back to the styles of elected officials again, is if that weight on you is the correct weight, the intent behind what you're doing is correct, then the weight is tremendous. And that doesn't even talk about, as I said, I've been dealing with public budgets and things like that for decades. But to go from building a new school, for example, which is being involved in, the construction and not overseeing, but just being involved as a principal, because I was the principal designate of that brand new school. And they were building it right beside the set of portables that I was having students in. But $14 million or so. But going from there, and you're talking about now budgets in the billions and the hundreds of millions. That's drastic. So the level of understanding and the level of experience and the level of what you're doing, because I often chatted with family shortly after I was elected and talking about a topic, and they say, you're talking about tens of millions of dollars. And to me, it was already, part of the ballgame. To others, it was, a total different grass. Like an individual talking in their budget, they're talking of hundreds and thousands. Here, I had to be a part of, and 1/15th part of, a $3 billion budget, and being thrown from. And the difficulty is you're elected in late October or mid-October. You're sworn in late October. And you have your budgets for the next year in mid-November. So less than a month of being active, you're listening to presenters about how you should be spending, a $3 billion budget and where you're going. And so that is the weight you're talking about. And if you take it to heart, you darn hope you're making the right decisions. And then you do the research. I mean, there were days where you sat and you pored over documents and you had to think on your feet drastically during the presentations and a number of things like that. So it's not something you're prepared for, but it's something you have to immerse yourself in. And they say you're drinking from a fire hose, which is absolutely true. But I think it's even more than that. It's willing to make you have to make a decision. You can't sit there and say, I abstain. That's according to the bylaws, it's impossible. You're there and you say yes or no. You actually
go ahead.
You actually hope you make the right choice of those yeses or no. Yeah. So
well, and that's what I want to get at, because municipal politicians have it the hardest. In Alberta, if you're elected in Calgary, you go to Edmonton. If you're elected in Calgary, you go to Ottawa federally. If you're elected in Calgary Municipal, you're still in the same community that you were elected in, and you're going to the same grocery store most days to go get your groceries. Mm-hmm. So when you're making those yes and no's decisions, how hard is it to have elected official time and personal time? Because as an elected official in municipalities, you are on 24/7.
Well, and that's where I go back from my previous career. I mean, it was no different. In a large city, you could be a principal of a school nowhere near to your community, and maybe never see them. But you're still out there, because if you do something as a principal, it hits the papers pretty easy. So that wasn't. And I taught in many small communities, so. I coached in, minor sports, many of the students that went to my school, and I worked in many of the civic clubs like Kinsman and a few other of these with the parents of my students. So that wasn't new to me, and it wasn't an issue to me. And you kind of live by the rule. And I remember going to a session where the clerk's office was talking about FOIP and a number of these things. And, when we were first elected, like shortly within the week after we were elected, trying to give us a little education, I guess. And And some of the candidates, or the people that won, were just shocked that, other people could send in a request and see your emails. I was dealing with that for 15, 20 years. So the aspect of the community wasn't that drastic for me, and I understood it because that's part and parcel of community life.
So what was the biggest shocker to you?
I joke often, and probably this is it. I didn't realize how many people disliked me till the day I was elected. And so that is the biggest shocker is, but even though I knew that there's so many differences out there in society of difference of opinion, different personalities, different viewpoints, I never really thought that it would come down to, you're an elected official, so I hate you. And part of that is probably because of interactions in the past where, they haven't, people have done it, but done things that they shouldn't have done, I guess is a better way to put it. But that inability to separate, and even now we see, council members who are saying this council has to go. And we see that from our own council members. Like, it isn't here's what's wrong. And in my previous career, I was always taught that you don't attack the individual. You may talk about the topic and say how, the way this topic or the way you said this is incorrect. But we have people out there who are so bent on attacking the individual rather than the issue at hand. So I would jokingly I'd say that, but that was probably, I guess, where, my biggest issue is many people just aren't interested in the facts and the truth. Many people aren't interested in what you've done, or they try to evaluate you on one item. You voted to not expand the dog park, and therefore I'll never vote for you again. And they negate all of the other votes that enhanced and bettered their community. But because they had a passion about one thing, or they didn't like you doing one thing, then they're mad at you. I stopped at one door that had a opposition sign on it, in future elections. And I always did this because I was looking for information. So I said, hey, I'm not trying to influence you or anything. I see you have so-and-so sign. Can you just give me an idea of why you have it there? And the response I got is, I contacted your office and you never got back to me. And I said, nobody got back to you? On what day was this? Because I'd like to fix that. No, someone did, but you didn't. And end of discussion, that was my biggest shocks, the mentality of some individuals.
Some people wanted to talk to you at every issue that they have. They don't want to talk to a staffer. They want to talk to the person who is in that room voting, right?
And exactly. And I mean, my ward is the largest geographic ward in the city, and it's the largest populace, or the most populous ward in the city. So the difficulty is saying that just because you called doesn't mean I have the capability of getting back to you individually. If you really need to talk to me, then we set that up. But if someone in the office can solve the problem, then why should they not be able to? Because at 100,000 plus individuals in the ward, there's just absolutely no way I can give individual attention to absolutely everyone. But those who desire it, then we work around it. And then they get mad because, they can't talk to me for a week rather than on the spot.
Let's talk about your legacy. 10 years as city councillors. What's your most proudest achievement so far?
And again, I'll say this on the onset because I like addressing this topic more than any other one. It was taking the $52 million tax room to start the Green Line. And I say that was the best decision I ever made. It didn't change your municipal tax bill in any way. What it did is it changed the portion that went from the province to the city. And then the key there is if we take that $52 million tax room, dedicate it to a specific project, which of course is the Green Line. And I mean, that's obviously my most important and most proud of project, if it ever gets off the ground now, because, it's been the ball that's been bouncing for a number of years. And gosh, I wish someone would catch it in the glove and put it to bed. But that is a huge, to be to be the catalyst, and again, I'm not trying to say this, because I'm promoting myself, but I think everyone will acknowledge. But to be the catalyst that is bringing a piece of infrastructure, the largest project in the city's history, the project that'll affect hundreds of thousands of lives and make everything better. To me is something that I'm going to look back at for a long time, and taking that first step of and boy, did I get raked over the coals by a few of the media people, who constantly write that there's always something wrong in the big blue pen. But it was the absolute best decision. And to follow that up, to back it, I don't do things just because. And I know you talked earlier about sometimes people get into the job to do a specific task.
Yeah.
I was there, to bring transportation and recreation to Ward 12 because we had none. In 10, we had no libraries, no skating rinks, no swimming pools, on and on and on. And of course, we had very poor, and I say very poor, not because it was bad transit, but for you to take a bus to get to the core and it took you over an hour to get there, that's very poor. It's not because it could be any better, it's because it just didn't work. And the C train was the only way, to improve that situation. And it's been talked about since the 80s. So I mean, it was time that something was done. So for me to be able to, and the way I sometimes describe is we created the opportunities for the Green Line, and then we capitalized on those opportunities. The fact that I was able to, at that time, to take the $52 million, and it was set aside, and people came to me during the discussion, and people, of course, there were some on the right saying we've got to give it back. And so to give the $52 million back to the individuals, we could have done that without question. And it would have made a $20 or $30 difference a year in your life, for 10 years. So that's $200 to $300 in your pocket for 10 years. But taking that for 10 years was over $500 million to go to a transit project that was well needed. In over 30 years, that's a $1.5 billion project, a contribution to the project. So that process, that style and that ability for me to talk to the MPs and the MLAs and to the other city councillors, and to realize that this one simple decision would allow the whole thing to go for. Because without that decision, we just wouldn't even begin to even thinking about a C train. And I'll expand a little bit longer, because to go from $0 to $4.5 billion in 4 years in 3 years is lightning speed when you're talking about public works. Because we had a few dollars set aside to do a study in 2011. And then in 2015, we had commitments of $4.5 billion when it all sat down. And I mean, that's massive. So,
yeah. The Green Line, it has been a controversial issue in the last, I would say, 12 to 18 months. Prior to that, it was something that council was unanimously supporting. It was one of the issues that people thought, okay, this is done. This is said and done. It's over with. You just need to vote. You're just waiting for the province to get off their blanket and actually put up the money as well. Earlier this year in 2020, this council, there was some tough talks about the Green Line. What do you chalk that up to? Is it just political maneuvering now because of potential election in a year and a half, or was it actual reasonable questions that they were addressing, that they were uneasy about the potential location of the Green Line?
I think, again, if we look at it in true aspect, a $4.5 billion project, and I'm saying this with respect, but at the same time as saying it with reality.
Yeah,
a $4.5 billion project is not something that a city administration should be shepherding or overseeing. it's just too massive a project. And I don't think we took that serious enough at the start. And so it led for a few missteps, some overseeing and a number of things, even though they had outside consultants and people coming in and looking at it. It probably wasn't done to the nth degree that it should have been. And so that led to some missteps as far as staffing and putting, people in place and the right there. And it allowed for difficulties to come forward. It allowed for different interpretations and different views. And often when administration goes down, and I'm saying administration in loose terms, but when a public project goes forward, it becomes the heart and soul. And I have to admit, the Green Line, that was the heart and soul of my last 8 years or 9 years on. I never really thought we would be at this level, in that short a time. I never really thought, though, that we'd be taking so long to actually finish it. But it led for an opening. Then we got into personality conflicts, because that's what happens to some degree. And then we got into backers of certain personalities. And I don't mind saying that the prominent businessmen who came out and said, oh, you can't do that, they were really taking their feedback from certain personalities. And they're saying, and even though they were looking at it in an honest and open manner, the original plan was in retrospect, was way too over our heads. Building a tunnel under the river and going 7 stories deep and all of these sorts of, but that came from we had the best engaged project ever in the history of the city. And so we listened to the people, and I often say that that's okay, but if you go out with a blank piece of paper, you're going to get absolutely every concept in the world thrown at you. I often, an example is you should go out with a plan, a style of a cup, to simplify is what I'm trying to explain here is, and then you talk to the people and say, okay, we're going to build a cup. Here's the constraints we're stuck in. What do you think of what we come up with? And, they might tell you they want it taller, shorter, fatter, different color, different style hand. They might want a stem. They might want all of these things, but you're staying within that concept of what your restrictions are. And then you take that feedback, you go back and you change the cup to fit what their response is. And then you go back and say, okay, we listened to you. Here's the changes we made. Here's why we made those changes. Here's the changes we can't make. And here's why we can't make those changes. What do you think now? And then they'll give you your feedback again. And then you take that feedback and you go back and you build a cup and you say, take it back to them, say, we listened to you. Now we're done. And we didn't do that. Okay. We went out with a blank piece of paper and we said, what do you think? And then, of course, we took feedback from absolutely everybody. And, those who don't want the thing, well, put it underground. The most expensive way you can ever build a mass transit, put it underground in this section, extending it here, doing this. Those who want, better public realm, well, fix my sidewalks and, do better trees while you're building this, which expands the project, and on and on. Well, I don't want it. I think you should go, above grade here and then build a station and, and on, those sorts of types of things. And we went way past any of the capabilities that we could actually do. And going back to the plan of let's build a tunnel from Stampede grounds all the way to 16th Avenue in the north, underground in the core, under the river, through massive changes of geographic makeup or geotechnical, makeup of the ground from bedrock to gravel to clay and all of these sorts of things. There should have been some, I think, restrictions put on and said, look, we can't afford to do a tunnel. So we can do a tunnel here because that makes sense, but we can't go anywhere else and we can't go that deep and we can't do these. They were planning, the original concept was to put a tunnel 7 stories below ground. And that's where your station was. So the first off is how do you get air? How do you do it? The cost of doing it? How do you get people there on a regular basis? You know, like, are you going to take an elevator to go 7 stories down to get onto this train to connect? That was, I think, the difficulty we had, and that let it open to a whole lot of things. But they did come back, and they're in a spot now where I think they're exactly where they should be. They have a technical risk committee that's made up of absolutely fabulous individuals who are internationally renowned experts in the field. They're looking at getting a management board, which again are made up of experts internationally and national, to oversee the actual project itself, not having city administration or city transit people or looking after it, which is again is because there's so many, in a $4.5 billion project, there's so many little things that could cost a lot of money if you're not careful, if you don't have the experience behind you. So they're absolutely in a fabulous spot now. But because of all the muddy waters, it's taking people a while to get there and saying, let's move on.
Now, no one's ever going to be 100% happy with no matter any decision that council makes. You have publicly said that you wish that the Green Line was a little bit further south. Like it went a little bit further south in the southeast in Ward 12. Looking back on your 10 years on this issue that you've been so championing, that is your defining legacy in some sense. Are you content of where it is and what is going to happen with this Green Line as of today?
Yeah, well, I had an opportunity when some of the other councillors came out of saying, let's take it to the south and be done with it. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I could have jumped on board, but let's go back to those 3 styles of elected officials that we first started about before. If I was a politician, I would have jumped behind that and said, oh, this is absolutely the best, and it would have been done with it. But I'm not, and I couldn't do that. And I wrestled, many times about what to do and where to go and all of those sorts of things. So I could have taken the project from 7th Avenue and wouldn't have made it maybe all the way to Seton, which is the hospital, but would have made it much closer than it is, which is, far better. Would have been great for my ward. But I have another saying that I've come up over the 10 years with lots of little sayings that some I've stole, some I've put together, and I've often said, and I've used this over and over, as I will fight for Ward 12, but not at the detriment of the rest of the city. And for us to do that, I firmly believe, so I'm okay with the decision. I'm disappointed we couldn't, ink out farther south, at least to Mackenzie Town. And I believe we'll be getting there shortly. It still may be part of this because they have set aside such a huge contingency fund and things like this. I'm really hoping that there's going to be funds left over to be able to expand it in phase 1. And Mackenzie Town makes an absolute sense. So that's, my fingers crossed, my inkling. But the project that we have as it stands now does the most expensive, most complicated section of the Green Line. And it finishes and it allows for expansion at south and north, station by station, just the same as we've done with all of the other lines, the red line and the blue line. They built a section to start, and then they added a station here. And then 2 years later, they added another station. And then 3 years later, they added another station. So the piece from 16th Avenue to Shepherd, as it stands now, allows for that development. When you get a few $100 million, and I say a few, 2, 3, 4, then you can add a station and you can move forward and you expand the line that way. Had we stopped in the core, it would have been very, very difficult for us to continue because you're expensive. You got to go farther underground. You got to get over the river with the bridge. And then where do you go? And, a number of those things. So even though it didn't fulfill what I would have loved to have seen, I still think it's probably the best decision that we could do for now. We could have listened and gone on and gone from 7th Avenue, to Auburn Bay or Mahogany, or maybe Seton if we were lucky enough. But that ridership drops because you don't get the north ridership. You don't get the more expansive downtown core by going a little north of 7th Avenue. So you don't get that ridership because people aren't going to walk 4 blocks to get on a C train. If it's one block, they'll jump on and away they go. So you lose, and even going farther north in that district, you gain 2 or 3 blocks on east and west of it, not just the north section. So the outlook that the transit, the Green Line team came forward with actually really outlined that this was the best ridership, the most revenue, the easiest to expand in the future, and gives a better service to both sides, north and south. And then you battle after that when you are able to extend it, who and where it should go. But according to the criteria and multifaceted criteria, we often heard the North people say, well, it should be done on ridership because we have the highest ridership on the bus. But the multifaceted criteria, the South had the worst service. It got more cars off the road. If you look at the actual stats, the only thing the North in 20 years from now will have is a slightly higher population than the Southeast. We beat them as far as occupation, more cars off the road, less greenhouse gas, more employment centers, hands down, if you look at the stats. Yeah. And we're building for the future. And that's why I think this decision is exactly what it should be. It's building for the future.
We're going to transition a little bit here, but this question is a sort of a transitional question. COVID-19 hit 2020. It has caused some hiccups in Calgary. We are one of, if not the top, depending on which week and which month it is, of COVID cases within the province of Alberta. From your standpoint as an elected official, how are Calgarians handling this pandemic, do you think?
I mean, I would have to state overall, and that's where you come back from overall, I think they're doing a fairly decent job of doing it. You're going to have that outliers and coming back to the individuals that are there. And I've had discussions with many people and, the anti-mask rhetoric, and I don't mind saying that, is absolutely ridiculous. Someone takes a puff of a cigarette, puts on a mask and then blows the smoke out and says, well, see, they're ineffective. Look at all the smoke that comes out. A mask is not going to save you in any way, shape or form. But if you have COVID, that mask will greatly reduce the possibility of you giving it to someone else. And if you're not looking after other people, then you're not much of an individual, in my view, yourself. And my mother is turning 103. And the last thing I want to do is pass on, even though we know the stats are that if you're elderly, and elderly in this case means over 60, because that's, but if you're elderly or you're compromised, those are the populations most vulnerable. It's attacking after, anyone and everyone, and even some of the children, that have some severe side effects to some degree. But that's what society is all about, is doing minor things like wearing a mask and I hesitate using some of the words, but I may in this case, is the stupidity of saying it infringes on your personal civil rights is just so far out there. I can't understand it. The fact is that you might be able to save other people's lives by wearing a mask is to me is different. But coming back to how we're handling it, if I'm older, I get it. I'm an official senior citizen, and I'm actually getting my old age pension soon. So it may be different for me in the mentality, but I can survive of not going out for a beer with the buddies. And if you can't, then I have a hard time understanding that. But that may do to the age. It may do to the civic responsibility I have, but it's definitely a blow, and I don't know how to overcome it. And those are debates that we will have for a long time of whether we went overboard or did we do exactly what we had to do to lessen. Those who are saying, look, at our cases are terrible, so nothing you're doing is helping. That's a debate. I don't know if they didn't do lockdowns, whether it would be worse or not, to tell you the truth. But I think we can look at the states and a few of these others and say, you know what, I think it would have been worse had we not done something. But I feel for those individuals who are suffering because of it, because in general, the small business, the service industry, and the oil industry, have been hit extremely hard. The rest of the occupations that, we have there, they haven't been affected as great, but the service industry, as many cases, have been decimated, and the reduced oil demand and everything, and plus the other things that we've had in Western Canada have really hurt the economy. So that being said, I don't know where to go. We see a federal government who believes just throwing money everywhere is the way to go. I'm not positive if that's the aspect, but it's making other people's lives easier as well. But what's it going to do, in 10 years when we really have to come face to face with the taxation that we have?
You announced in October that you would be stepping down, like I mentioned at the beginning of the interview. A councillor's job is not done until that election day on October 20th or 21st of 2021. What's your priorities for the next few? What is Councillor Keating going to be trying to champion before his time in office is officially done?
Well, I'm certainly going to be keep pushing on this green line. I mean, we got to get the shovels in the ground before I quit. And then, so that means I still have to do work with the provincial government, and I'm doing that with some, letter writing and the research and a number of those sorts of things. I had a notice of motion a little while ago looking after something in my ward. I have another one coming up talking about a high school that needs to be built in the south, and what can the city do? So I mean, those are still issues, and there's no project that is not worth pursuing, even though, some might try and label me as a lame duck. But the point is, I still have a vote for another year. I intend to use that vote to the best of my ability for Ward 12 and for the city without question. And if someone comes to me with an issue, and I had a chat with an individual this morning that, someone took his sign down and won't give it back. So those are the things that you do. Whether or not it's right or wrong, and developing. I have a meeting later today with someone from the planning department, because some of the restrictions on a few of the development permits may seem a little excessive. So can we talk through and solve those issues? And so that's the job, and it'll go until election day. And actually, I'm a councillor for a week after election day, because you're official until the swearing in ceremony, and then you're done. So
one of your councillors, Councillor Ray Jones of my ward, Ward 10 up here in Northeast Calgary, stepped down earlier in October as well. How has council been able to adapt to the reduction of that council? Are you guys looking after Ward 10 as properly as you can be in the situation with no sitting councillor in that position?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And on my own part, we are required to sit on two committees. And I probably am the first councillor who has ever sat on all four of those, because normally you divide it up and you each sit on two. So I've taken over his spot on two of the committees he would normally sit. And so I sit on all four of those committees rather than just two. So others are doing the same thing. We have Councillor Giancarlo Carra and Councillor George Chahal, who have divided up his ward between them, and they represent him in that aspect, because they straddle him on either side as it is. And what they've done is they've retained all of his staff and put his staff under the supervision of the I believe the manager of the councillor's coordinating office, and so she's supervising his staff, and they've taken his ward budget, which allows them to do, to mail outs and to coordinate things or a number of things, and they've taken that budget and they've assigned it half to those two councillors that are looking after his ward, so they can still get the information they need and a number of those aspects. So I think that as much as I hated to see him, go, it was definitely the best decision. But I think we've covered it very, very well. And I think those individuals will continue to service Ward 5 without a question.
Ward 10.
Sorry, Ward 10. He used to be Ward 5 for years, and it still sticks in my head. Sorry.
Two last questions. Last question. What's the biggest challenge Calgary faces heading into 2021, 22, 23, 24 for the next council to deal with? What is the biggest issue? Is it COVID, or is there some other underlying issue?
No, those other issues, those are big issues to deal with, but they're issues to deal with. I personally think, and maybe that has a lot to do with my style as an elected official, I think the biggest issue that we have right now is getting rid of Trumpism. And we've jumped into that mode. And I could talk about a councillor who, in my view, is a mini Trump. The weaponized misinformation, the style of, if I can make everyone else look bad, it makes me look good. The misinformation, the way in things are said that absolutely are in some cases absolutely untrue, and in many cases just a misrepresentation of what actually went down. I think we're delving into the slate of issues that are out there, for the municipal election, where people are trying to, get together a whole swack of people that have the same mentality, which isn't going to give us good service, as a municipality. If you don't have a wide-ranging viewpoint on many issues, you don't get a great discussion and you don't get a great decision. I think that that is the most serious thing that I think municipal politics is going to difficulty. And I'll probably say the name wrong, but I met Craig Oliver, I believe is the correct way to say it. He was the CTV correspondent for many years.
Yep.
I met him a while back, and he said, "So when are you going to run for provincial or federal politics?" And I said, "Never." And he was quite surprised that I would have that. And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, Craig, I would sooner call you an idiot because you are, not because you belong to the NDP party." And I can't go down that path, but that's what we're getting into in some cases in the municipal politics. And the Manning Foundation, even though it had its drawbacks, did a number of good things. It had a councillor tracker for a while, and it showed that Calgary Municipal, or the council here, had the most diverse voting pattern of any major city across Canada. And you could actually study them, and you would see places like Quebec City and Vancouver and where, a whole group of people voted exactly the same every time a topic came up. And that defeats the whole purpose of democracy, especially in municipal politics where it is, down to getting the streets fixed and making sure the snow is removed and a number of those things, and giving equal disperse of recreation facilities and stuff. So I would say that was my biggest fear, is we're going to really see a downgrade in what actually Calgary's municipal politics is actually like.
I am conscious of time, but I have one last question for you. The moment after the swearing in of the next Ward 12 councillor, what's the first thing you're going to do? Are you just going to sigh a relief, or go just relax with your family, or what is the first thing you're going to be doing?
Yeah. No, but I think that's it. I mean, I am going to move. I'm going to retire in a smaller community. And so that process is already in the works. And so that will probably be the last thing will be done is picking up the last little bit of stuff that has to be moved and do that. I do want to take my time, and my wife and I are hoping to be a bit of a snowbird for 3 months in the winter and escape. We'll plan that out and see if that works, the way we want it to, and decide whether we like it or not. And if we don't like it, well, we'll find something else to do. I'm an avid woodworker, and I have my shop already planned, and it's built, and it's ready to go. It's a matter of having the time to get in there. And so I hope that for many of my children and grandchildren, I'll be able to make something that they might want to keep for a long time.
That's awesome. Councillor Keating, I want to thank you so much for doing this. Greatly appreciate it. It's been a pleasure chatting with you and getting to know the man behind the tweets and the person who's behind the podium at the council table. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. It's been a great discussion. I enjoyed it.
Thank you once again for listening to the Cross Border Interview Podcast. If you loved this episode of the Cross Border Interview Podcast, head over to iTunes or wherever you get your podcast and subscribe, rate us, and leave us a review. All the links to our social media accounts are in the show notes, or visit www.crossborderinterviews.ca. The Cross Border Interview Podcast was produced and edited by Miranda Brown and Associates Incorporated. Be sure to tune in for our next episode of the Cross Border Interview Podcast. Once again, thank you.
Whoa!